Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Are you ready for the new CMS and ONC proposed rules? We're very excited to bring you this webinar and just a few administrative details before we get started. So as you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So in your GoToMeeting control panel, you'll see a questions box. Please type your questions or comments into the field and hit enter. Please note that the recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck, will be emailed to all registrants following the live webinar, and you can actually go ahead and download the slide deck from the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to our first presenter today. Greg, it's all yours.
All right, Samantha, thanks so much, and I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate everyone's time today. A lot of things have happened. A lot of things are happening in our industry, and we're here to kind of give you a sense of where we're seeing it and from what we're hearing from the industry and being kind of involved in this whole process. With me today is going to be Maxim Obronsky, who's our Senior Director of Product Management at FHIR, and he's been on the front lines, as probably a lot of you on the call have already know. You know him at Connectathons, and so I'm so glad that he's here to share his best practices and his information about the technical side of how to implement APIs and FHIR. I'm going to start us off with a little bit more about what's kind of happening in the industry from a rules perspective, from ONC, CMS, some of the drivers that are happening, and then a very basic overview of a FHIR-based open API, what it is and what you can do with it. And then Maxim's going to get into the final half of really the best practices before implementation, kind of questions to ask, and then into the approach. We do have a ton of content, so I'm hoping we get through in the time allotted. And so we want to keep this as educational, informational as possible, but the first slide, obviously, we have to kind of tell where we came from and how we've learned this information. So this is just who FHIR is in this large community of FHIR plus interoperability. So we've been working with a while back into clinical data integration, probably know us as the claims and financial integration validation company, but really been putting a lot of effort into how we move clinical data between payer and providers, and now consumers, as you'll see. But we've been on codathons, we've been interoperability showcases with HL7, and now we're a founding member of the Da Vinci project. We think is kind of the ideal, kind of the first real business cases that are being put out there, which is kind of the drivers where we're going to see FHIR being adopted. So I'm not going to go through this. I just want you to understand that for a while we've been in here, and this is what we're learning. This is the essence of what FHIR community is all not vendors, the open community, payer providers, even users getting together and really working out, what FHIR can be used for, like APIs and FHIR, right, and the use cases that drive them. So this is the essence of the community that we're trying to build here. So let's just get into this. From the drivers and impacts, I'm going to start off, kind of talking about what the drivers are at a high level, both from a payer and a provider, but we're going to focus today mostly on the health plan and the impact. So, but the two rules that are coming out, the ONC, NPRMs, and the CMS's operation or the access rules, they kind of work together as we've seen. So we're going to be kind of blending the both together. So when I start off, we have to have drivers, right? And so the biggest drivers currently today are business use case driven. So if it has anything to do with cost, driving down costs, or improving the top line revenue, right, it's probably already been thought of, right? So if it's a quality metric, right, it's a risk scoring, if it's care management to help out patients in a population, these use cases are probably already kind of happening. And the data that we're being asked of the providers is already starting to happen or has happened. And so just for instance, I mean, a couple of people already know these, but I won't go into them in depth, but claims processing and prior authorization, really combining clinical and administrative data, have found that now you can effectively define and verify medical necessities. So that's a big one. The HEDIS measures are somewhat new, but these are quality metrics. These are how we get paid if you have a line of business in that field. So this is really driving down bottom line, driving up the bottom line revenue, right, and reducing costs. But this is really how do you get reimbursed, and also, that star rating. We all know the star rating, so we want to make sure our communities are healthy. Risk and adjustment and risk scoring, better designing contracts that everyone can understand, and they're fair, and they're goal oriented, so they know where you're at, and so it's not one sided. We're all working together. And then finally, really the ACO model measured against benchmarks. Once we have these benchmarks, now how does this data really, adding the clinical data with the claim data and the financial data, how's that going to help us move forward when it comes to avoiding really health events for our population? So let's start with this graphic. Right, we know data is being consumed. The data is being held in silos, both on the provider side and the payer side. And so this data currently is probably in proprietary databases or any data structures that are not standardized. And so currently, what we're doing as a payer or a health plan or an ACO, when we need data, we ask for it. We say, providers, right? Send me, this chart, or send me information about why you're doing this procedure. And so they have to push this data to us somehow, right? If we have a connection with them, great. That might be, a permanent, point-to-point connection, or it's an attachment using some of the attachment standards that are starting to come out. I shouldn't say standard yet, because hopefully we'll have one. But the idea that they're pushing data to us has really been, the kind of the standard. And then along the lines, we've said, what about the member, right? And member patient, right? They're in the middle of this all things. So they need to be getting their data as well. And that's one of the big key drivers, is making that data accessible, not just from a push or going to a portal or, getting it from in a file, which they can't use. They need to have this. So, any kind of app or any mobile app that they have or using needs to be able to use this data. So this is a huge deal. We knew that there was three players, probably even more in our ecosystem, but we've been pushing data to these for a while, and and the use cases have been driving this. Now we have two more driving forces, and it's really come from a state of a mandate, right? So when CMS on the right-hand side is pushing new processes around interoperability, right? What you need to do, really mandating certain usage of new technology standards, and also kind of meeting access rules for consumers, that we're going to take an effect on payers, right? Health plans are going to start seeing that this is going to make a big change. And then if we go to the left-hand side, we get into the weeds of the spec. What is an API? What's the criteria? What's the certification for this? What's the FHIR standard? What data sets are available, right? We hear this word of data blocking. What does that mean? So these are all the things that ONC's put together as guidelines and more specifics around them. And as you can tell, they work together. They talk about each one separately. So when CMS says, you need to make data available via the ONC USDI, well, they're referencing the ONC. And at the bottom, you'll see that other organizations like Da Vinci, the blue button from CMS, and we'll talk about, Karen, projects are happening that are making this happen. The technology is out there, but we now have to figure out how to connect the dots, right? What's the data that we need to store? How do you standardize that? And that's really what we're getting to, is building an API in front of your data, right? And now making a structured data and making it so it's queryable, so it can be queried. So this could be queried or pushed, but in this instance, we're not pushing anymore. We know where our data is, hopefully, and we just need to go and ask for it. So, and we don't have to pull large files anymore. We can ask for discrete data sets. So then we can make, it's faster, lightweight, and we can make quicker decisions. And so now we have this kind of interoperability, hopefully, right, between our three constituents here in our environment. So that's sort of our driving business cases and mandates. Let's hope that these three forces will get us over the interoperability hump. So let's move into the next slide. So what's empowering our users? Great projects out there, right? So one of the concepts that we've been researching and what's popping up is this idea of a consumer-directed exchange. I mean, if you go to Karen's website, they do a great job of They do a great job of defining what this is, but it also is more of a concept, right, where the consumer is asking, right, or has the authority under the HIPAA guidelines to say, I want to request their information, our information, and I'm going to use some type of application or even a third party. How do I do this? How is this going to be effective? And how really are we going to implement this? So the important feature about the 2.0 button, and remember, there was a 1.0 way back when, but we think that the 2.0 has really kind of made the mark here, because they've written a guideline into the new FHIR standards, release 4, that now can be used by everyone as a framework. So you don't have to say specifically, call it blue button, but now these artifacts, right, the mobile artifacts, the resources, the EOB and the patient resource that they've already made, guidelines for, is available to you to kind of jumpstart your minimum viable product to meet some of these standards. And so definitely something to look out if you haven't already looked into those, something that we put a link down at the bottom to get more involved in. The idea and the concepts behind the blue button really was to reduce patient burden, right? A research organization might be able to pre-populate a Medicaid list for patients during a clinical trial, right? The idea that streamlining information about different kinds of care over time, that would be a primary physician can access information on another patient, related maybe to better inform of treatment, something like that. And then another suggestion would be to uncover new insights that can improve health outcomes, right? A pharmacy that can determine if a beneficiary gets healthier over time, sort of a trending. And then access and monitor health information in one place. Some type of health application can now aggregate data, right, into a health dashboard for a beneficiary. All these great ideas, right, that are kind of blooming out of this 2.0, which came from the Medicare, which has been given access to, 53 million beneficiaries. So those artifacts are out there to use. When we get down into the Care and Alliance, we're not going to too much about this great starting place. So they're making it, really, paving the way around the consumer identity, authentication, health plan policies, acute care, the pharmacy side, and then trusted frame and code ethics. So the biggest part is, how do I map not just clinical data, but maybe even claim data, the 837 to FHIR. And so you can see when we start talking about mapping, this becomes a critical piece to this equation, and the Care and Alliance and such is really helping us move forward and taking the ring. And this is another perfect example of the community coming together and moving off of just the foundation that has been kind of mandated by our government and by states and by other entities. And so this is a great example of us moving forward in this industry. Okay. Next one. Sorry about that. That's my fault. So I'm driving. What are the industry use cases? And so if you're not familiar with the Da Vinci project, there's a couple of things that have been, if you went to HIMSS last year or this year, you'll see some of these in action. The data exchange for quality measures and coverage requirements. We showed scheduling. We showed medication attestation, all these great things. And we were working with a whole bunch of actors, right? Not only the EMR vendors, but integration vendors like ourselves, working with payers and providers, all working within a room to show how these use cases work. And so, what the Da Vinci project really brings is, defining requirements, both technically, business, and then from a testing perspective, creating these implementation guides so we can follow standards, creating test and reference implementations, piloting some solutions, and then really deploying how to deploy this in the real life. So they're really taking the front here and moving forward. On the left-hand side, I just kind of put out some things that we've been hearing from our clients is what they think that FHIR could help them with. And these could be care gaps, authorizations, referrals, the ADT, which is going to be a big one where you have to know when one of your patients or members leaves from a hospital system. Scheduling appointments seemed like to be the low-hanging fruit, where a portal you could utilize either a member could members couldn't do it now, but what if a plan acting on their behalf, maybe a care team acting on behalf of the patient, can set a schedule within a trusted environment? Use cases like that are starting to pop up, right? Eligibility, quality measures, then the big one, chart. We hear, this idea of how we get chart retrievals and do extractions and find, missing measures using charts. How is that going to happen? Because it's a pretty costly process right now. Medication adherence I missed, and then do we really fire enable attachments, right? I mean, how do we get down to making attachments work for everybody? So these are just a few. You need to define this, and this is one of the things that we're going to go over today is really, the questions you need to ask to get started. But before we do, CMS has a roadmap for you, and if you haven't seen the CMS roadmap, I think you definitely should check this out. So we'll start at where we're at now with the rules been proposed. The turning point is going to be the certification from ONC, right? Promoting the interoperability, moving to provider directories, making patient data available, all the information that you need to be able to send. Then trusted health networks, connecting to those, the reporting late 2020, reporting clinical information, making sure electronic addresses are available on directories, and then notifications, and then improved benefit coordination. So we do have a journey here. We do have a path. Let's see if we can move forward. So we're going to take the few and actually highlight a couple of impact statements. But before we do, quickly, I love this line from Stan Huff, right, from Intermountain. The ONC proposed rules supporting the use of HL7's FAST standard or FHIR standards for healthcare application program interfaces, APIs, is really a turning point. We're really certifying these, right, making sure that this works. And so I'm hoping that this is true. I'm thinking that this is true, right? I think the market and the community is thinking as well. So, just for time, you can research these, but the EMRs and the developers are now being held to a standard. No more information blocking. By exception, there's rules, but the data now has to be accessible via APIs, trusted APIs, obviously, and then it's standard format. Their certification standards, and then this is actually changing the Cures Act, bringing in FHIR for the first time to say this is a standard that you need to be working with. All right, and we'll be talking about the security and all the other stuff and how to do that. So, who does this affect? Well, anyone under a public or state plan that's being funded by the government. So you have Medicare Advantage, your Medicaid managed care plans, you have the qualified health plans, and then anything connected to the exchanges, that is, and then these CHIP agencies, state agencies. So if you're one of those, this is going to impact you. And then I made a comment down here that if you read the rules, they're really trying to stress for the commercial side to do this as well. And we're hearing from our advisors, right, from the MedEffects Advisor Board, that if they do go this down the road for these lines of business, then why not adopt this across the board? So this is hopefully will become a best practice. You put the infrastructure down, it's reusable. So what's the 5 impacts? Health information sharing. We got to make better engagements with the patients and to strengthen those relationships. Got to make sure that historical claim data is available and is in a format that it can be done. Care coordination with other providers, other payers, improving coverage and provides members and outcomes. So really the coordination between the other entities in this ecosystem. And then the fun one is, if you haven't already connected to a trusted exchange, better get on it. All right, build out that connection or get certified. There are going to be things coming out through the TEFCA, the new draft that just happened. I think the draft 2 that came out that'll explain how you get on these or what that'll entail. And then finally, your provider directories now have to be opened up. They've probably already driven through a portal, but you have to publish your open APIs, and you got to make sure that your providers are updating these and that they have an electronic address and that they're accessible. So let's move through these real quick. From the patient access APIs, what CMS is requiring that you publish your APIs, making sure that they're open, consistent with the standards. The data that's going to have to be available will be adjudicated claims, right? Provider remittance, encounters from capitated providers, clinical data. If you are storing lab data, you must be able to provide that. If you don't store lab data, then you don't have to, right? It's really the normal operation. If you're capturing it, you need to share it out. And as you can see, the compliance date down here, we think this is really aggressive, making January 1st the deadline. We do tend to think that these get pushed off in historical realm, but it's a shooting point. I mean, this is something that they're making it, they're putting a big push behind this. How this will how this will impact the plan. If you haven't already made support for FHIR, you're going to have to learn FHIR pretty quickly, right? Or find a vendor or a partner vendor that can help you get your learning access or learning around FHIR. what the resources are available. You need to start downloading, if you haven't already, some type of interface to consumers, right? The blue button is a nice framework. It already has EOB and patient resources available, so you can actually have that as a starting point for your minimum viable product. Support for OAuth. A lot of people who've already been in this mobile space on IoT kind of internet, you already know what OAuth is, but if those who are just learning this, they're going to have to add support for OAuth. There needs to be a new repository. This will come probably with the FHIR server. It has a repository, right? You can enable your current repositories, but it's recommended that you actually either map or put an interface to the new data repository so they can be structured and modeled under the FHIR terms. I won't go into the phases, but the CMS has definitely laid out that there's going to be planning and budget involved. You have to make claims available within 1 day of adjudication. That goes for encounters as well, making sure that these things turn around and they're updated quickly. Remember, there's an estimate here. I'm not going to tell you what CMS thinks the estimate is because I think it's short. I think if you work with what's out there and you can be smart, you can get under the budgets, but CMS has put their estimates out there for plans. Next, historical data and payer coordination requires payers to support beneficiaries in coordinating their care between payer and payer. So this is really the idea of a minimum data set that needs to be moved back and forth, and it has to go back 5 years, right? So the impact to a plan is you need to make sure that you have multiple methods of electronic exchange. Are you using an API? Are you connected to an HIE? How are you using IHE protocols? How is it that you can actually move that clinical data or that patient data at this point, right? They are going to mandate the USDI as a standard. We'll go into that. The format is going to be FHIR. Needs to be 5 years of patient history. The biggest one on this page, if you take out of it, if you don't have a consent management platform or if you can't expand the consent management platform, start looking for a partner to get your head around this because it's a huge issue. If you allow access to data that has not been consented, you could fall under a HIPAA violation. So this could be a huge issue. You need to talk with your security framework team, your security team, and governance team that makes sure your consent platform is intact. So moving forward, CMS doesn't estimate minimum cost to this, but I think with the consent management, it will add some cost if you haven't already. So the next one would be participating in trusted exchanges. So this will require the plans, right, and health plans to actually connect to information exchanges. And what they're laying down is a foundation for future proposals for payer-to-payer, payer-to-provider type of interoperability. So this will, that ultimately will leverage the idea that you're connected to some type of trust network. So the impact here for plans is you're moving PHI data. You have to now onboard to some type of trusted exchange. You have to go through a certification process, an onboarding process, and testing process, right? So there's going to be that. The details for onboarding come through the TEFCA, right? They're not 100%, and they're kind of vague, but they're right now going through get budgeting for the RCE, which would be the governing entity. You'll have to qualify if there's areas that are QHENs, they'll have to qualify to become QHEN, and then you'll have to go through some onboarding requirements to get connected. The idea that you might have to use technologies like IHE and Direct Connect or for secure exchange, these are things that you should be already thinking about if you're moving clinical data. You have to support both inpatient EHRs and ambulatory EHRs. And the idea that you're using secure messaging, you have to now get this idea of electronic querying by patients, providers, payers, whomever. That's a whole big difference than just knowing who your partner is and having a point-to-point. Now it has to be open. So CMS is estimating this as minimal cost, depends on where you are on the timeline. So let's get into the fifth one. This is the fifth impact, is really opening up the provider API, provider directory using an open API. This lays out not only the idea that you need to manage, publish the API itself, but the information in that electronic address needs to be updated, and it has to be updated within 30 days of changes, meaning if a provider moves offices, right, moves anywhere, that update needs to be updated within 30 days. The idea that now we have really up-to-date information, we can call to that information and make part of workflow calling to this provider information. How that might impact, I don't know if there's a huge impact here, but provider networks must be available not only to the enrollees that are current members, but then you're going to now open it up to prospective enrollees, right, that are looking at this information. So that might be a big change. It has to be available through a defined API, which are defined in ONC. Data must be updated, as said, pretty quickly. Ensure that data is information for providers available using. So this information is a community. Means the developers need to have support so they can support the beneficiaries. So if you're supporting the developers, then you have to have all the tooling for onboarding, testing, right, for making sure that they're testing correctly. So there is probably a program around this that you might want to put together. And then CMS is not proposing this for QHPs since they should be already doing this. And so at the end, CMS really thinks that there's a minimum cost to this. And I still think that if you haven't done it, then there will be some impact. So what have I missed here? I think that's good. So I think we're on to our first question. Sam, do you want to open up the first question and I'll ask it while we're doing it? So the first poll question, is it up yet?
It's up.
Okay, great. I'm just looking at my screen. So which of the 5 proposed requirements will be the most challenging for your organization to meet? A would be moving to bidirectional health information sharing. B would be sharing historical claims data. C would be coordinating care with other health plans. D would be participating in trusted health information exchanges and making provider directories available through open APIs. Okay. Looks like we got some feedback here. I think there's a fight between A and C. Come on. So it looks like moving to bidirectional health information. I think that's a big one, right? I mean, it looks like this is probably going to win. I feel like I'm a horse race. Come on, A. Looks like we're at 42%. Okay. Yeah, I think we're seeing some, the range here is obviously A and C, right? The idea of moving from bidirectional health information sharing and coordinating care with other health plans. Seems like this is a big deal. How do we talk well with our competitors, if you will, in same markets, right? How do we build this trust? How are we going to build these connections? And what really is bidirectional, right? So I think we got our hands around that. This is what we're seeing. If you're working with your vendors of choice, right, and your integration companies, you should start saying, I can't just share this data. How am I going to consume this data? So this is a different way of thinking of the world. So it's right in line with what we're seeing from one of our customers as well. So I'll give you, I think you can read it, 44% said A, right? And then the second was 27% with C, coordinating care. So great. Let's close that out. I think we need to get back to the, all right. Can you still see my screen? Are we good?
Yes, yep. We can.
Awesome. I think there was going to be a transition there, and I think that it's going to work fine. So the next 3 slides are just going to be about a little bit of an understanding before we get into best practices about implementing. So what do you know about FHIR, right? What do you know about open APIs? Well, if you haven't already been in that mobile space, which is sort of presented on the right, you're kind of up for a rude awakening if you haven't already got into this. And even if your company and certain divisions or organizations are doing it, you're going to have to take their knowledge and now bring it across either all lines or different organizations and make this thing complete. So really where we're starting, I want you to remember 3 things, right? Where is your data? Where is patient data or member data for that matter? Where does it live? What will be required for you under the mandate? What needs to be accessible? Pretty much everything 5 years back, but I would say if you look at the minimum data set, where is this data? Because it could be diverse. It could be everywhere across your organization. Where is it? So understand that. That's bottom up. Second is, if you haven't already started working with FHIR, you're gonna have to start thinking about how you enable this data to be in the new format, right? So how is it gonna be either mapped, right? Or is it gonna be consumed? So how do we enable this somehow? And then finally, we gotta wrap an API, we gotta create an API. So, this resource now has to be accessible. So how are you gonna manage that? Is there an API strategy that you can leverage, or do you have to build one? Huge, big things, from a company. If you haven't already done it, this could be big steps. So really the writing is on the wall. We want to make sure that it's really time to modernize and move toward, from away from these legacy kind of standards and into new innovative standards like FHIR. And then, are you equipped? I mean, that's really the big question is, are you asking their questions? Are the right people involved to do this? As APIs can ensure the health exchange record is accessible to the right internal and external users while remaining protected from any type of outside threat. So, this is the concept. This is the kind of three things I want you to remember. Now, I'll quickly go into what it looked like, what would look like from a user's perspective, right? What is this FHIR-based API? It's a ready-to-use information model, right? FHIR is that machine-readable spec, right, that uses RESTful calls or REST server. FHIR goes one step further, right? It's not just the access and how to call it. It really gives you the informational model of how it's stored, and then the semantics to go along with that. Really ways to extend that data model if you need be. Not getting too much trouble with customizing the idea that you can extend this, and then that where it comes into terminology and all the information that kind of comes into that. So if we think about this, a common way, from a FHIR perspective, is really a common way to represent data. The building block is the resource. The reference would be the rules for connecting them. So you have the open API would be the access, and then from a FHIR structure, you have the data model. A lot of times you see this. You just see the API, the resource, which is the ID, which doesn't change, right? It's specific to that resource, and then you might be calling something referenced like a patient information. The nice thing about FHIR is you can ask for a specific data set. So you just want patient information, or you just want that patient ID or patient information, you can pull that. Or if you want everything on that patient, like charts, observations, order forms, then you can call all of that information from a particular time frame. So you can start bundling these calls and start forming what you really want from that information. So you could be creative. So the exchange specs are simple and straightforward, right? Based around direct description. XML is on the right-hand side. You say it's represented of the resource. The exchange models can be both in XML or in JSON, and they could be included in individuals and bundles, as I mentioned. One great example, I'll give actually two examples, really. So you can use the patient ID to call, for observation, which I mentioned, the one resource, or you can call for all orders from a particular time frame. Let's now put this into HEDIS, right? We just passed the HEDIS season. What if you could say, hey, for patient so-and-so, I'm missing a measure. I need charts, I need information on this measurement for this particular time frame. Well, you can bundle that in, and if all of the practices, right, that you're going were FHIR enabled, you could be creating that data without phone calls, right, without all of the manual processes, and we could be more efficient and streamlined. So those are quite some high-level examples where you can really see leveraging this new technology. And understand that FHIR has been a strong public and a private support for EHR vendors like the Epics, the Cerners, Apple, Google, like everyone. You'll see them at the conventions, you'll see them at the interoperability showcases, you'll see them out there. They're leveraging this, right? They're helping adapt this. So, this would be, I think, a community type wide structure. Okay, last slide. So how can you use FHIR? So it really is up to you. I like to think that, and I found this great article on the Health Samurai, so you can go check it out. You can get inspired by the community. You can access open APIs that are already out there. So if EMRs or the EHRs or all of these clinical systems are already enabled with an open API, you can call to the data as long as you're a trusted user and pulling patient data for your needs. You can also create APIs on your existing data, which is some of the things that we're going to be seeing in the mandates, making systems extensible. Create a marketplace like Smart on FHIR, right? We have an ecosystem of developers. And then, so from on that though, there's kind of two things you need to think about is how do you really, open up your existing system, and Maxim will go into this a little bit, but there really is a kind of a facade where you can write middleware to convert to code, right? And then there's the adapter where you would do one-time dumps from your source data into the FHIR server. So you have to think about which serves you best and how you would now enable this. Then you could just build a native FHIR system. If you want to build from scratch, right, for new deployments and make this as your core, then you can leverage the FHIR information model and all the different models that are available on the HL7 website. This really reduced double modeling and translations and a lot of mapping going back and forth. New concepts, CDS hooks. We've heard a lot about this, where we invoke decision support, from a provider EHR workflow. It actually can trigger, so you don't have to make the initial call. There's a call that will actually send out when something happens in the EMR. Patient is discharged, something happened, right? These could actually be triggered calls that actually then can execute some type of care plan or care intervention. And these could be sent to payers as well, right? For, sending out maybe a request for more information of some sort. So CDS hooks is also the thing that we've been actually pushing in at HIMSS and all these interoperability showcases. Like, how do we support that? And DaVinci's on that as well. And then finally, once you standardize your data in FHIR, the support for JSON now creates, for these modern databases, now you have a standard structure. You can feed all of your BI, ML, AI initiatives. Structured data is brilliant for, moving to these larger scale type of initiatives where you can really start seeing, insights from this data. So I think I've covered enough. Maxim, did I miss anything before I hand it over to you?
No, that's a pretty good summary.
All right, man. So I will hand the torch, man.
All right, thank you. So in this section, we'll talk about not the question of how, but more a question of why. I think the PowerPoint
Did I just close that out on you, man?
Yeah.
Wow, that was so nice of me, wasn't it?
It was indeed.
Let's do this, man. Let's try to find where I stopped and you want to start. How about this?
Yeah,
way?
It's just slide number 23.
No, I got it, my man. Here you go.
Okay. So before getting into the how to build the FHIR server, what do you need to do to expose the data and so on, you really need to come up with an answer to 4 key questions. First is, why are you doing this? What is the business driver which pushes you towards this implementation? Are you trying to be in compliance with the mandate? Do you need to do some infrastructure change to get the competitive advantage, or to just stay on top of your competition and be supportive to your partners? Or is this a combination of all those items, or is there anything else? Based on this business objective, you can then move on and decide who in your organization will take care of things like security policies, because there will be data access and we deal with the PHI, so you have to be really careful about the security. And given the fact this is the new API, a new way to access the data, there will be new security challenges. So you really need to be strict about it. Then comes the content. You will have many different pieces of information you need to expose, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So those pieces of information will have to come together, and more likely they will come from different departments. So you have to have somebody who will coordinate the data delivery and coordinate the data collection across the company. Technology infrastructure, you need to make sure that you have technology experts who are knowledgeable enough to govern the process of using this or that technology. You need to make sure the licensing is intact, again, the security is in place for this technology, and so on. So you have to identify those roles in your enterprise in order to be successful with your future implementation. Once that is done, the next topic for you to think about is the timeline. Timelines are always critical. There is a deadline for the mandate, but beyond just the deadline, internally in your company, you need to know, do you need to make a research? If you need to do that, it needs to go first. So it'll take some time. So plan for that. And if then you need to do some proof of concept, or if you need to do something else like experiment with the technology, that also will take time. So all that planning will need to start now in order for you to be successful in the future. Because if you just start doing things ad hoc as they come up, most likely you will not be in time. And in the best case, you just won't be able to provide your partners and your members with enough information. In the worst case, you may come to penalties or some issues with CMS for not being in compliance. Once the timelines are set, the last but not least is the question of budget. Who will pay for this implementation? Because payment is critical in any solution. You'll need to decide which departments or which budgets this will come from. Typically, the departments or the groups in the company which benefit the most will contribute the most to the solution. So you'll need to identify those departments or heads of the departments, talk to them, and try to come up with a consolidated budget so you don't run out of money before you complete the solution. You need to find the executive sponsor in your organization who will oversee and who will direct the budgeting for this project. Once all these 4 items are solved, then you can come to the implementation and you can begin thinking about the technology challenges. And there are quite a few of them. You need to consider many things. The sourcing. As I said, you will have different data sources. You will have databases, you may have SQL, non-SQL. Data will come in different formats, so you need to provide the migration from one format into the FHIR. And when we talk about migration, usually the problem of mapping comes up, and we have mapping on this slide, and we keep using this problem throughout the deck because this is a very critical point in your implementation. So once you define where the data is, how to convert these, and how to organize it, the next comes the correlation. It is not just enough to come up with various assorted pieces of data. You have to really put everything together. So whenever somebody accesses the patient information, the patient information must come in a very good aggregation. So it needs to come with the lab results, it needs to come with the allergy information and counters and so on. So unless you do the proper correlation, the data can just fall apart. Once you solve that and you have the data very well aggregated and correlated, you can talk about the connectivity, how the data is going to be exposed to the outside partners, who will access the data, how the data will be accessed. And again, we have the access talking point here as well, because connectivity and access and security, they always come together. You need to make sure that only people who have the right access can get that data. You need to ensure that all the certificates got rotated, the passwords got renewed. So all those many topics you have to consider while doing this implementation. After that, there is a new beast which was introduced, and this is the consent management. Consent management is a very complicated problem by itself, aside from everything else we talked about before, because not only do you need to make sure that the patient can access his or her own data, the patient may grant access to literally anybody else, and you need to make sure that that anybody else has also the same access to these patients' data. It can be either a relative or it can be somebody else who has permissions by this patient to access the data. So consent management is another step towards the proper accessing the data. And then things like mapping, storing, you need to store the data in the FHIR format. Since all of your, as we talked in the sourcing part, all of your data comes from different places. You have to aggregate this and you have to come up with the proper FHIR repository. So that repository can maintain your data, and that repository is sustainable, meaning as your data grows, you need to also make sure that the FHIR repository is capable of handling that much data. And then last in this section, but not least in terms of priority, is the data sharing. You have to share the provider directory, and whenever provider makes any change, you need to ensure that within 30 days, that change gets reflected in your API. So you have some SLAs, and you have to provide those SLAs in order to be successful with the implementation. Once all of those problems are resolved, there are additional challenges which you may see down the road. Those challenges not necessarily will come up during the initial phase of the implementation, but we want you to be aware of these as you go down this path. The challenges usually come when you talk to different vendors, and we have a lot of experience with that. That's why we're sharing our problems we've seen in the real life. Like, you need to connect to the hospital with purpose of collecting the medical charts or collecting some medical information, and the hospital tells you they have the EMR system which is perfectly capable of exposing the FHIR information. Like Cerner, Epic, pretty much any major EMR system has this capability. However, every EMR system will be different. They will use the different version of FHIR, and even within the same version of FHIR, you may see different treatment of this FHIR. Some EMR system would allow you to post the data, some EMR system would not. Some would expose only the patient and encounter, some may expose more data. So the proper way of approaching these type of issues is to create some custom, that's what we tend to come up with, some custom, we call this plugins. Those are specific implementations based on FHIR, which take into the account what individual EMR system has unique in terms of how FHIR is treated. Beyond that, there are many other questions, like you cannot support all FHIR versions at once. Right now, there are 4 of them, but in 5 years, I'm sure there will be 10 more. So how do you approach that? The typical solution is to use, we call them step up, step down components, or step up, step down solutions, where you standardize on the version of FHIR you consider to be the most frequently used. For instance, if DSTU2 comes in the mandate, then this might be your choice. However, EMR system may use FHIR version 3 or 4, so you will have to downgrade or upgrade the information, the resources, to the version which you are using. And this is the typical approach you would have to come up with. Next come the maps. Maps will be essential to your implementation at the beginning, in the middle, and in the future. You will always have to go between your current EDI, HIPAA, HL7, CCD, XML, JSON, whatever else you have, and FHIR. And same thing with your partners. In many cases, you will have to work with your partners and accept the data in the format they have. And then that data has to be brought into the FHIR format. So there are many more issues. Those are just the few challenges we decided to put into this slide, but there are many more, like how to simplify your business UI, how to make sure that you do not change your UI and lots of your mobile apps, web apps, whenever the new FHIR version comes up. So there are many technical challenges you will see. However, all of them have the solution, and some of them are listed on the right side. So there is always an approach how to solve this or that problem without jeopardizing your end-to-end effort. And for this, for the NPRM mandate, one of the most frequently asked question is, what information do I have to expose? I have so many data, it's really difficult to choose what is more critical. So tell us the list of things we have to expose. And ONC came up with a list of information you have to expose based on the category. And this slide just summarizes what needs to be done. What does it mean for you? For you, that means you have to analyze that piece of data, and you have to build the maps between whatever you have right now. Let's say you have the clinical repository, you have the member information, you have the admin or financial data. So you have to build the maps between that data and the information you have to expose. You don't have to expose it all if you have more than needed, although they are welcome to do so. But in any case, the mapping will be a critical point in your implementation. And we suggest you think about mapping, how to approach the map. It can be either the third-party solution, or it can be your homegrown solution. You can write the Java code, Python, whatever you choose. Typically, third-party vendors would offer you some UI like you see on the screen, where you can visually drag and drop things and indicate how you would map the data from what you have into FHIR. But it is not necessary. You can do whatever you choose appropriate. The key point is the maps will have to exist, and we encourage you to begin thinking about the mapping specifications, how you will map the data ahead of time. Because if you leave this up to the very end, it may be too late to really implement this, because the amount of work for building the maps may be significant. Now we come to the set of survey questions that we have. It's survey question number 2. The question is, at what stage of the implementation process is your organization currently? There are few answers. The answer number 1 is we're just learning about the rule and the implications. Answer number 2 is we're planning and budgeting. Number 3 is researching solutions. Number 4 is contracting and implementing. Hopefully you're in this stage, but we'll see. And already have a solution implemented.
Well, the numbers don't say that. So the numbers are saying that we're in learning mode still.
That is, unfortunately, that is what we see in the industry as well, that most of the plans are just realizing that there is a huge amount of work which is ahead of them. But let's give it a minute and see what other people respond.
I think this is a blowout. If I was a betting man, I would take A.
Yeah, but it's good we have this conversation now.
So hopefully it's good. It's good, but what's scary though is the time frames, right? I mean, that's the one thing that from a CMS and ONC perspective is they put these really kind of aggressive dates on. So I'm pretty sure that's going to change if we're still researching as an industry, right?
Correct.
So we'll close this one out if that's all right and keep on going, because I think we only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, let's look at the results and we can close out with the couple remaining topics. Yeah, about 80% of you are just learning about this and what implications it has. So hopefully this presentation will help you moving towards the planning, budgeting, and further steps. To help you with that, we came up with some best practices we think will be helpful to you. So several things to consider. The solution which you're building must be non-siloed. You will have to deal with different departments. You'll have to deal with different data sets. And unless you just close the solution, if you close this solution, you won't be able to really adapt to the changing needs. Like if tomorrow you need to expose some additional data, you won't be able to do so. It has to be standardized and traceable. You have to follow the standards, don't reinvent the wheel, and make sure you trace everything as you implement. So you need to trace the access, you need to trace the security, you need to trace who has access to what data, which data was made available, and so on. Solution must be flexible. That's the counter to siloed. You have to make sure that whatever you build can sustain the increased needs, can sustain the new data sets, and so on. And of course, it has to be logical. That means do not build something you think will not be usable. So start with the bare minimum and then grow the solution based on the requirements or based on your partner or customer requests. Those are the high-level solutions. Now, there are some essential components you have to put into the solution. You have to have the reference implementations for typical use cases. To do so, you have to have the maps. Again, the maps. You have to make sure that the data gets properly extracted and properly presented in the FHIR format. Authentication and security. Again, we talked about that a lot. You have to make sure that data is secure, there is no data leak, nobody can access somebody else's data without permission, and so on. FHIR server. With FHIR server, you will have to have some FHIR storage to consolidate your data before it gets exposed. So think about that and pick whatever FHIR solution you think appropriate. Analytics server and web portal, those are two sides of the same problem. You have to provide the information into the outside world. Your members need to log in and get their data, and you have to have the backend analytics to analyze the data and see how the data flows within your organization, what you have exposed, how many, and so on. Those are high levels, and on the next slide we'll show you the more detailed diagram of how the typical solution would look like for the NPRM problem. It is pretty much the same thing as before, but with more details. You have to have some type of the FHIR module which can handle the calls from members, patients, and the health plans who have your former members. That module will need to have, again, maps. It needs to have the proper FHIR server. You need to make sure your maps are US CDI compliant. This is the data sets. You need to expose the connectivity mechanisms. You need to have the provider directory. You need to have the blue button endpoint, because this is the way CMS and ONC mandate that data to be accessed by. HIE integration, and of course, authentication. At the bottom of this, there is a runtime engine which needs to support all of these moving parts, which includes the integration with the member matching mechanism. You need to make sure the consent management system is in place and available to the runtime engine. And of course, on the right side, there are different backend systems you will have to access in order to expose that data to the plan members and to the other health plans based on the NPRM. Next, please.
Yeah, I think we're at the end, man.
Yeah.
I got one more survey, or a couple more survey questions.
Two more survey questions. The first survey question is, given everything we discussed today, what do you anticipate will be your biggest challenge going forward? The answer number one is lack of in-house technical expertise. Number two is limited funding. Number three is short implementation time. Number four, lack of clarity on requirements. And the last one is developing an internal compliance roadmap.
I think we should have taken number C out. We'd already talked about the timelines being so short, but so that was kind of a given.
Yeah, it sounds like this is the biggest.
Yeah.
First biggest challenge after the lack of the in-house expertise.
See, the lack of expertise is at least that self-aware, right? The idea that you don't have the expertise. Either you're going to try to gain that knowledge, you're going to leapfrog by using partners, right? Or you're going to try to go to the outside, like to the work groups and try to gain this knowledge quickly. So there's a lot of ways to get that expertise, but at least they're self-aware.
By the way, since we're talking about that, and we'll have a closing slide. You're welcome to come to our booth at VIDI so we can provide you with more high-level details and high-level technical expertise if you need. So wherever we can, we will share with you. Yeah. So based on the results, everything is as we just talked about, the short timeline and the lack of the in-house technical expertise. Those are two biggest challenges. And the last survey question is, what would you like to learn more about these going forward? There is so many information, so much data, and so many talking points. So number one is adopting and implementing the HL7 FHIR standard. Number two, developing APIs for Blue Button and provider directories. Number three is establishing a connection with a trusted HA network. Number four, designing an internal roadmap to meet deadlines. And the last one is meeting new requirements while still ensuring security. We'll give it another minute. And yeah, I think we have enough answers to close the poll.
Oh, it looks like
we have just 1 minute left.
I like this one because, we had A might be the winner, but it looks like it's spread across the other three.
Yeah, I agree.
Distinctly.
Sounds like that all information is needed, although the initial adoption and implementation data is the most critical.
Yeah, it's good. Good stuff. All right. So, sorry we had to push it to the end. It's the last, we have a minute here, and then. So, Maxim, do we want to try to take a couple of questions until we close it out right at the hour? Knowing that a lot of these questions, if you have them, we will be at WEDI. We are available. We put our email addresses out here. I can't believe we did that. Did we really do that? Yeah, you can email us, right? Any questions, we'll get back with you, or see us, the team at WEDI. So we have you want to take a question, or do you want to just take emails? We can, if you have any questions, we'll take the emails off of the chat and we'll send it out.
Yeah, we're on top of the hour already, so I guess we'll close.
My apologies.
We will make sure to answer your questions.
I think my section went long, so I appreciate everyone's time today, and we'll get the questions answered in a follow-up email.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.